Assalamualaikum and very good morning to my friends and my beloved lecturer. Today I'm from Group 2 will present about audit of purchase cycle. So basically this our group members name and without wasting any time we will continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum and a very good evening to my lecturer and my fellow friend. So today me and my friend will present the topic of audit of purchase cycle. So my name is Nur Najwa Akila binti Zulkafli with metric number 268078. I am the first presenter, so I will present the introductions of this topic. The first thing we need to know is what is audit of purchase cycle. So audit of purchase cycle discuss the classes of purchase transaction, cash payment, and also the balance of account payable. The purchasing cycle consists of the acquisition of goods and services for in exchange for cash or to pay cash. So in audit of purchase cycle involve purchasing transaction that start with the acquisition of goods and services, and then a purchase order is placed for the goods and services, and then service and good and service are then received from the supplier, and finally is to record all the bills and payment of account payable. So this audit of purchase cycle includes the purchase of raw materials, equipment, fixed asset, utilities, and repair and maintenance. However, audit of account in the purchasing transaction in the purchase cycle usually consists of combination of substantive tests and tests of control to support an assessment of control risk that is below the maximum or at low. The next is for audit objective for audit of purchase cycle. So audit objective for audit of purchase cycle is to evaluate whether the account affected by the purchase of goods and services and the cash payment for those purchases are fairly presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principle. So the key issues in audit purchasing and payable are to ensure that all purchases are recorded and not understated, and all payable resulting from credit purchases are recorded. And now we will see the diagram below here. For the transaction objective, which include the occurrence, completeness, cut-off, and classification. And then we go for balance objective, which include the existence, right and obligation, completeness, valuation, and also allocation. And the last one is the presentation and also disclosure, which includes occurrence, right and obligation, completeness, classification and understandability, accuracy of the transaction, and also the valuation.
Okay, now, nature of purchase and account payable. First of all, the auditor should understand the purchase and payment and purchase adjustment transaction process. The process of purchase cycles includes receive a request from other department, normally come with by certain documents such as request form to support the transaction. The control of this cycle should be placed in the company to reduce the amount of fraud possibility to be happen for each process. Auditors should assess the effectiveness of control in the company to minimize the amount of misstatement or fraud in the financial statement. The proper control should be designed by auditor based on the identified risk. The risk is depend on many factors and the audit approach is performed based on the identified risk. There are numerous account flow in the purchase cycle, which is A. Purchase, cash payment, account payable, purchase return and discount.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Nabawi bin Safidin, metric number 268062. Today, I'm going to continue the presentations. My part is accounting system and control activity. By implementing an adequate control of activity actually is important for purchase and payable account because they will give an impact to the whole business. Those business that don't have an adequate activity controls might be face some unexpected things in the futures. Next, as we can see here on figure 10.2, purchase and payable functions. There's 5 main functions in purchase cycle that should we know. First, purchase requisition forms. The documents that involved in this stage is purchase requisition form. Second is receiving and storing goods. The document is good receipt note and inventory record. Third, recording and purchases the liability. In order to record the purchase and liability, that should be involved a purchase journal and account payable on it. Fourth is preparing purchase order. The document is purchase order form, and lastly approving the supplier invoice, which is in supplier's invoice. So first function is purchase requisition. It's the first transaction trace of documentary evidence. The authenticity of the request form need to be checked first to ensure that there is no fictitious transaction created, and also to ensure the occurrence of the purchase transaction. On the purchase requisition forms, there should be a print numbers. Actually, it's a form of control in order to ensure all the goods are received and ordered correctly. Second is preparing purchase order. The preparation of purchase order is assigned to an independent department from the warehouse in order to avoid any fraudulence of goods for personal use. Purchase order PO are used as an audit evidence for the occurrence of purchase transaction. Actually, purchase order are similar to a purchase requisition form. A purchase order describes precisely the goods or service required, quantity, price, delivery mode, and the supplier's details such as their names, their address, and also their phone number. Third is receiving and storing the goods for inventory. Approved purchase order will be sent to the warehouse, which is the place where the goods will be received by a storekeeper from supplier. The storekeeper also will prepare a pre-numbered goods receiver note. In short, we know as GRN. GRN plays and roles to describe the goods, quantity, and also the conditions of the goods. GRN also are used as an evidence to support the occurrence of the purchase transaction. The goods receipt note, GRN, will be sent to the accounts department and serve as an important evidence to support the occurrence of the purchase transaction. To ensure the objective, completeness, accuracy, and cut-off of a purchase transaction record, an independent check on the sequence number pre-numbered GRNs is made by the accounting personnel. And fourth is approving supplier invoice. A supplier's invoice will be sent by the supplier to the accounting department after the storekeeper receives the goods. So here is the control that should be established by the entity to ensure that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to ensure that these 6 objectives will be achieved. First is completeness. All supplier invoices are recorded by providing serial number for all invoice received. Second is occurrence. All suppliers' invoices related to a valid purchase transaction by checking the invoice and matching against the GRN and purchase order. In order to ensure that the occurrence objective, the person in charge should checking the invoice and matching it with the GRN and purchase order in order to ensure that the goods are being ordered and receive the right goods. Third is accuracy. All supplier invoice amount are accurately calculated at the agreed price. Means that they will be free from any calculation error. Third is accuracy clarification. All supplier invoices are correctly recorded to appropriate account such as expenses or asset by providing a code to each account. Yes, this is important to classify each invoice, such as if the invoice are meant to be an asset, they should be put on the asset accounts, or otherwise it should be put on the expenses accounts. Fourth is occurrence. Payment are made to a valid supplier. The supplier invoice is approved before the invoice is paid and recorded. And this also is a control that to ensure that the payments are made to the right persons. Before they make a payment, the invoice must be approved first. After that, the invoice already can be paid to the person that are responsible to receive that payment. Lastly is occurrence. Lastly is occurrence, accuracy, and completeness. There is no delay of payment or unpaid suppliers invoices by preparing a pre-list of supplier approved for payments. So, by preparing a pre-list of supplier approved, there is no delay on payment or unpaid. So, the payment will be paid at the correct amount as well as the correct time. So next, I will pass to my friends to explain further about the functions. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum and hi, my name is Muhammad Syakir Aizad bin Rushdi, metric number 268074. And now I will explain about recording the purchases and liabilities. Controls should be established when recording the purchases and liabilities to ensure that first is completeness, to ensure all transactions of purchase and liabilities are recorded. So completeness is focusing on the numbers of transactions. Let's say if there is 100 transactions, we need to record all the 100 transactions. Second is occurrence, no unrecorded liabilities and purchase. So occurrence is focusing on the recording. Let's say if I'm at the purchase department and I make a purchase transaction, I need to record the purchase transaction. Next is accuracy. The amounts of purchase are recorded accurately. So accuracy is focusing on the amount of the transaction. Let's say I purchased an inventory amount of 100 ringgit. So I need to record 100 ringgit because the 100 ringgit is representing the amount of the purchase that I have made. And lastly is cut off. Cut off all transactions that are recorded in the proper period. Let's say the company start its accounting period at 1st January and ended the accounting period at the 31st December. So all transaction during the period we need to record it. So next we move to payment transaction. The process of cash payment for purchase and payables involve the following. First is paying the liabilities. Second is recording the payments. So there are several objectives that we need to achieve to make sure that everything is fine. First is occurrence. Segregation of duties between personnel who has the authority to sign the checks and personnel who initiates or processes purchase transaction. So segregation of duties is to make sure that there are no error or there are no fault that happen during the transaction. So by avoiding these types of problems, we can make sure that all the transaction had been recorded. Second is accuracy and accuracy. The check signer should ensure that the payment documents are supported by valid and approved suppliers invoice and that the amount are correctly stated and details of suppliers such as name and address are matched and agreed with the supplier's invoice. So here we need to make sure that the accounting documentation is enough, is sufficient, because we need to compare some document with other document to make sure that the information that stated in the document is the same. Let's say in example we compare checks and supplier invoice. At the document we can see whether the amounts is same, the supplier name is same, and the address is same to make sure that the accuracy the accuracy is achieved. Now, third is occurrence. Indication of payment should be made to the supplier's invoice once the payment is made to avoid resubmission for the duplicate payments. So here we can say that this is to make sure that there are no double payment or there are no double accounting in this transaction. And next is occurrence. The custody and mailing of checks should be under the responsibility of check signer to preventive or alteration. So in this job we need to make sure the person that doing the custody and mailing is the same person. If there is too many person doing this job, there are maybe a risk where a error or alteration will be made by the person, such as if the person take the money and didn't record the and didn't record the transaction, or maybe he altered the amount of the payment, we cannot detect it. So next is occurrence. Checks should be prepared under the supplier's name and not payable to bearer or cash to prevent the checks from being cashed by unauthorized person. So here is to make sure that the payment is only for the specific supplier. Uh, there will be no error in doing the payment transaction. And next is completeness. Pre-numbered checks should be issued to avoid incomplete or missing checks. Like I said just now, completeness is focusing on the number of transactions. So when we pre-number the checks, we know how much transaction that we need to do. If there is 100 checks, then we need to record all the 100 checks. And lastly is occurrence. Only authorized personnel have access to blank checks and electronic signature to reduce risk of theft. So this is also to make sure that there are no unrecorded transaction due to theft or alteration, because maybe someone take the money and didn't record the transaction. So basically that all's for me. We will proceed to the next slide. Thank you very much.
Hi and Assalamualaikum. My name is Nur Shahida binti Rosli. My matric number 267988. So I will present about the developing audit plan. In developing audit plan, there are 4 things that should the auditor consider, which is understanding the entity to identify inherent risks, assessing risk of material misstatement, obtaining an understanding of internal controls over purchases and payables, and lastly is designing further audit procedure. So we go to the first point. Okay. So for the first point is understanding the entity to identify inherent risk. The auditor should understand the entity and its environment to determine the potential misstatement in the financial report. The auditor also should understand the nature of entity's business in terms of type of the company's product or services. This means the auditor should take a look at the cost of sales and also gross margin to determine their understanding towards the business product. And also, the auditor should understand the client's business and the average payment period of the industry, and also the nature of expenses such as level of purchases and payables. So next, obtaining an understanding of internal controls over purchases and payables. So the auditor should implement effective internal control to reduce inherent risk regarding to purchases and payables. The auditor should prepare a written description or a flowchart. Auditors also may complete internal control questionnaire to determine whether the internal controls are implemented successfully, and also this way to obtain the understanding towards the internal control. The auditor also may make inquiries seeking further details from the management and review documents to determine whether it is recorded appropriately. In the same way, monthly reconciliation is performed to avoid any unreconciled balance.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Adiba Nadia binti Zulkifli. Matrix number 267750. Okay, to developing audit plan, there are 4 procedures. The third procedure is assessing the risk of material misstatement. Based on information obtained from understanding of the entity, inherent risks, and internal controls, the auditor should assess the risk of material misstatement. The auditor have to determine whether the purchases are susceptible to risk of understatement due to pressure to report high profits. It means that the auditor have to determine whether the purchases are influenced to the risk of understatement due to the pressure. Next, the auditor also should determine whether the controls on transaction cut-off are successful in ensuring that sales and payables are reported in due time. The auditor have to ensure that the controls on transaction costs are successful to sales and payables are reported in its proper period. Once the risk of material misstatement are determined, the auditor should design further audit procedure appropriately. Next, for the fourth procedure, designing further audit procedures. The auditor should evaluate the amount of further tests that should be carried out because the amount of procedure performed is based on risk level assessors. The auditor should include tests of controls in the event that the auditor believes that there are internal controls in place for maintaining records of purchases and payables. But the auditor has not obtained sufficient evidence to determine as to whether the internal control systems are functioning effectively to mitigate the risk of material misstatement in the purchases and payable records. If the control rates are high, a higher level of substantive procedure should be performed to obtain the required evidence. The auditor also should resolve any substantial risk of misstatement by reviewing the design of the level control to assess if they are effectively controlled. Auditors also do not rely on evidence obtained in prior periods or analytical procedure to address any significant risk of misstatement in purchases and payable records. Thank you.
And then we proceed with the test of control for audit of purchase cycle. We have two tests of control, which is test for design effectiveness and also test for operating effectiveness. For test for design effectiveness, auditor use their understanding to determine the presence of essential control over purchases and payables. Auditor also need to understand the functions within the purchase cycle to determine the necessary controls and potential misstatement. They also should make a preliminary assessment of the control risk once auditor identify the presence of necessary control. For example, the function of preparing purchase order may occur potential misstatement which the purchase are made for unauthorized purpose. So, the control procedures of the control procedure for potential misstatement is that each purchase should be approved to avoid those purchases for unauthorized purpose. The next is test for operating effectiveness. Dual purpose tests, which are known as tests of operating effectiveness, will be testing by auditors to obtain substantive evidence. However, tests of control are only concerned about the number of misstatements but not the size, whereby these auditors need to cautiously when issued conclusions. For example, auditors may conclude that the control over purchase are not effective where their misstatements detected in the purchase transaction. Auditors should obtain sufficient evidence about assertion such as the existence, occurrence, completeness, accuracy, cut-off and classification of purchases and payables transaction unbalanced. For example, the assertion of completeness, which is when perform document inspection, auditor need to review the use of pre-numbered purchase requisition forms, purchase order (GRN) and also supplier's invoice. Then scan the sequence number of purchase order in the purchase journal and also trade a sample of approved purchase order to GRN, supplier invoice and also purchase journal.
Substantive test is based on the assessment control risk. The nature, level or timing of the substantive procedure is based on the result of test of control and detection risk. Auditor judgment can be used in this procedure to determine the detail. The auditor will use the moderate level of detection if the risk of the company for purchase and payable are high while their control risks are low. Level of risk detection could affect the amount of procedure run by the auditor to make sure the existence and occurrence of the transaction. Designing substantive procedure, the checks are susceptible to understatement, while the sales are susceptible to overstatement. The evidence is important to auditor to determine the completeness of purchase and payable records. Auditor need to make a careful planning in respect of nature of audit procedure to obtain the audit evidence regarding the purchase and payable. The most substantive audit procedure are required if the plan level detection is low. Effective substantive procedure help to reduce the detection risk when the possibility of the material misstatement still not detected. There are three types of substantive procedure, which is analytical procedure, test of details of transaction, and test of detail of balance. Initial procedure should be performed by auditor before perform the three types of substantive procedure, like tracing and compare the balance in current year and previous year of the financial statement. The auditor should list out all account obtained from the client and the amount reconciled to ledger. Plus, auditor should review any unusual entries, for example, account payable allowance or non-account payable inventory. Listing procedure of account payable. First, recalculation. Auditor add the listing and compare with the amount in the ledger. And then auditor compare the sample of supply details and balance between the listing and the subsidiary ledger. Analytical procedure is evaluation or comparison of financial information through analysis of reasonable relationship among financial and non-financial data. And this procedure is being performed in 4 stages. The first is to review the understanding of the entity as to whether any changes to payable balance are to be expected. And number 2 is to determine any volatility in amount of purchase and payable balance between current period and previous period. Number 3 is to determine the ratios and trend for gross profit and average payment period. And the last is to analyze expenses account by reviewing the ratio between each category of purchases with the total sales and compare with the previous ratio to determine the level of activity for the current year. Unusual change in gross profit margin compared to previous year may be cause of any possibility of misstatement in record the purchase. Test of detail of transaction is performed to address whether any particular type of transaction have been properly recorded and account during the period. It used to confirm test of balance such as purchase order, general receipt notes, and supply invoice. This test to verify the transaction really occur or valid. For example, vouching and tracing. Auditor vouch record purchase transaction to supporting document. It is to verify the transaction are valid. And tracing, auditor trace from supporting document to verify completeness of record. Purchase cut-off test is performed to make sure the current year purchase and payable are being recorded in the current period, and any changes of this account will reflect in the record of inventory and cost of sales in the current year. For example, company buy a raw material for the year 2020, so the auditor will verify whether the transaction being recorded during the year. Payment cut-off tests are designed to provide evidence that any payment are recorded at appropriate date. This is very important for auditor to perform a proper cut-off test to make sure the cash and liability presented are incorrect. Test of details of balance concern in obtain the evidence regarding account payables balance. These tests are not concerned with debit or credit of transaction but more on balance at the end of the period. There are 3 tests of details of balance, which is review of monthly payable reconciliation, confirmation of balance, and investigating for unrecorded liabilities. Auditor review the reconciliation prepared by the client and investigate any unreconciled balance. auditor should concern about understatement of account payable and the selection of account. If the customer statement is different with the amount at customer record, it may be due to the goods and cash in transit and dispute amount. Confirmation of balance is a written confirmation sent to individual supplier to confirm the amount outstanding and payable to supplier. The confirmation does not provide evidence of completeness, but it provides evidence as to existence, obligation, and valuation. This confirmation recommended to be used for auditor when the volumes transaction are substantial and detection is low. Important control in preparing confirmation requests are to get a complete and accurate list of suppliers, to confirm the amount, name and address are accurate when preparing the confirmation, and to ensure the confirmation is sent to supplier or creditor. There are 3 procedures to investigate unrecorded liabilities. The first is to examine subsequent period purchase and payment transaction. Second is to perform analytical procedure on expenses. And last is to examine any contractual agreement or commitments that raise the existence of liability not provided.